Good morning. Thank you. My name is Ryan Paul, and I teach history here at SUU. And I'd like to thank, before we get started, Dr. Lynn Vartan, Amelia Nauman, and the rest of the A.P.E.X team for the incredible slate of speakers that they've brought here this season. Our campus community has truly been enriched by the diversity of stories told from this stage. It really is SUU's premier event series. I'm grateful for the opportunity that I now have to introduce Dr. Michael Bertrand. I first met Dr. Bertrand at one of the coolest and most iconic bookstores in the world, Square Books, while I was completing my graduate studies at Oxford, Mississippi. I had returned to Ole Miss after a year of research and writing, and as soon as I got back to the university, my graduate advisor said, "You have to stop what you're doing, what you're working on, and read this book." The book, which I have my copy from graduate school, Race, Rock, and Elvis, changed everything for me. More importantly, its author, Michael Bertrand, was now teaching at Ole Miss, and we became fast friends, and he proved to be a very critical mentor to me. For a long time, the study of rock and roll had been the purview of music writers and journalists, and now for the first time, rock and roll was evaluated critically through a historical lens. This work truly was groundbreaking in this field. Race, Rock, and Elvis, this book, contends that popular music, specifically Elvis Presley's brand of rock and roll, helped revise racial attitudes after World War II. Teenagers who loved rhythm and blues, rock and roll, and other black-inspired music seemed more inclined than their segregationist elders to ignore the color line. We often talk about gospel and church music as the music of the civil rights movement, and we, to our discredit, neglect rock and roll in that regard. Just so you know, after the lecture, there are copies of this book available, graciously provided by the SU bookstore for purchase, and Dr. Bertrand will be happy to sign your copy. Dr. Bertrand has appeared in several documentary films seen on the History Channel and PBS and other outlets, including the Peabody Award-winning The African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross with Henry Louis Gates Jr. Dr. Bertrand currently teaches at Tennessee State University in Nashville, and now it is my pleasure to introduce my friend and mentor, Dr. Michael Bertrand.
Good morning. I want to thank Dr. Paul for that really gracious introduction. It has really been very special to me to have someone that I've worked with in the past basically bring me to the place that he's working now. And I really do appreciate that. And it was just great seeing him. We had dinner last night with several faculty members, including Dr. Lynn Vartan, also Miss Amelia Nauman, and Dr. Matt Newsom joined us as well. And I was really taken by the discussions that we had at the table and how much they were really interested in about promoting everyone's sort of a self-journey, basically to find themselves. And part of what this series is about, I think, from what I understand with the discussions with Dr. Vartan and reading about the series, it's a great series, and I'm very honored to be included. After watching all the people up on the screen, it just really really touched me very much. But I want to thank Dr. Bertrand, and also for everyone who's made me feel so welcome here. It's been really nice. And so it brings me to, before we get started with all this, talking about history just for a second. And James Baldwin, the writer, once said that history, although most of us don't realize that, history is not just something that you read in books, and it's not even just about the past. History is about something that we carry within us all the time. It is something that basically, unconsciously sometimes, basically determines what we do, how we think. It is what frames us. And so I want you to think about that. We're all historians. We are all historians. And think about that as we go through this discussion today. As all of us, we go through this discussion on a self-journey. I've been very fortunate, and I mentioned this to Dr. Paul's class earlier this morning. I've been very fortunate in being able to carry out my journey in something that I really love, which is looking at and examining and thinking about popular music. But we're all on a self-journey, and that's, again, I think what this series is about. And again, thank you for inviting me. See if I can. This person here on the left is John Sharp Williams. John Sharp Williams was a senator, congressman, lawyer, Phi Beta Kappa. The guy on the side over here, this is basically his Colonel Reb. And I know that Dr. Paul will remember this. This is the mascot for Ole Miss. And I just couldn't resist basically putting up this because it looks so much like him, doesn't it? Doesn't it look like him? Yeah. Well, the reason we're going to start off with John Sharp Williams is that in 1903, John Sharp Williams, who's from Yazoo, Mississippi, he's from Yazoo, Mississippi in the Mississippi Delta. And he was the wealthiest landowner, plantation owner in the Mississippi Delta. And in fact, the ironies consist, his plantation was called Cedar. And so John Sharp Williams was invited to give the keynote address at the Mississippi Historical Society in 1903, down in Yazoo, Mississippi. And he was speaking at the Yazoo Opera House. Now, for those of you maybe thinking, damn, they got an opera house in Mississippi or even Yazoo? Yes, they did. And so he spoke to a group of historians, and what he was telling these historians basically was what you should be doing as a historian. And he focused on telling the story of Mississippi and also the South that was organically connected to Mississippi. And he basically anticipated William Faulkner, and William Faulkner, who, very prominent writer who eventually wins the Nobel Peace Prize, or the Nobel Prize, once wrote that the past is never dead, it's not even past. Again, kind of thinking about Baldwin as well. And so Williams tells the people there, the historians, the professional historians who are there, that the history of Mississippi and the South has not yet been written. And this is 1903. And we're waiting for that philosopher historian who's going to write the history, and he says, that philosopher historian basically is going to have to write about the cause. And our cause, what that cause was, which is John Sharp Williams talking about, is that the story is how the South is to make sure that African American culture does not pollute white civilization in Mississippi or the rest of the South. That is the cause. That is why we have the color line, that they instituted the color line during this particular period. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. And so again, Williams was very much a man of his time. he was very much a man of his time. Now, I'm really big into ironies. I'm really big into timing and how things are really kind of like, why do certain things happen at the same time? 5 days before John Sharp Williams gave his address at the Mississippi State Historical Conference in Yazoo, W.E.B. Du Bois published his book, The Souls of Black Folk, 5 days earlier. W.E.B. Du Bois, one of America's leading intellectuals, basically was writing his book about the same thing that John Sharp Williams was talking about, the color line. But of course, he was coming from a different perspective, right? He was talking about how the color line basically divided people and how that color line basically was making every African American a problem. And so there is very little evidence that John Sharp Williams, who was an avid reader, again, he was a Phi Beta Kappa scholar, he went to several universities, including law school, went to universities in Germany and France. No evidence that he ever read The Souls of Black Folk. And again, it's not the timing, because pieces of this book, chapters of this book, had been released as articles in very prominent magazines like The Atlantic, things that John Sharp Williams would have read. But apparently he never gave evidence that he read this. Now the interesting thing for our purposes today, and you're wondering, what are we doing talking about music and talking about John Sharp Williams? If you notice on this book, if you had a chance to have read The Souls of Black Folk, can I see a show of hands? Anybody ever read The Souls of Black Folk? Anybody? Yeah? You remember every chapter, it starts off with a lyric and musical notation, which you can see, I can use a pointer here, you can see on the back of this cover, the musical notation. Du Bois admits that he is not a technical scholar of music. He admits that he's not a technical scholar of music. But he also says that he thinks music is extremely important. And in the last chapter of his book, chapter 14, the last chapter of The Souls of Black Folk, he actually talks about how music is the gift that African Americans have given to this country. Music is the gift. And he defines that basically with music, and I want to directly quote from this. It is the greatest gift because in that music, the meaning is always clear. The meaning is always clear. Sometime, somewhere, men will judge men by their souls and not their skin. And he says that it's the music that is going to transmit this. It is the music. Now again, there is no evidence that John Sharp Williams ever read that, but what it does basically is it shows a crack in the color line that John Sharp Williams thought was the past, present, and future of the South. Well, there's a crack in that color line. There's sort of a monkey wrench that's thrown in there because of the music. And so what Du Bois is arguing is that the white consumption of black music can actually bring about social change. And so what we see over the short term, and we historians, as Dr. Paul can say, we historians, we think in terms of centuries. And so in the short term, it appears that something is going on with popular music and race relations. We've seen jazz, we've seen rhythm and blues, we've seen soul, we've seen hip hop. All of these things have emerged. So the story is not yet finished. The story is not yet finished. But at least from what we see in the short term, there's been some disruption. There's been some disruption. And so again, we look at Du Bois, a model, he is creating a suggested model of what white consumption of black music can mean. Now he's going against the grain. This is Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, abolitionist and later civil rights advocate. Frederick Douglass writes in the North Star, a publication that he began in the 1840s. Frederick Douglass basically was living at a time when blackface minstrelsy, and that's the image there with Jim Crow. And again, you think about music and society, the Jim Crow, that terminology, we refer to the Jim Crow South, maybe Jim and Jane Crow South, later segregation. Historians figured that this is the only place they can figure that term came from, is the music. And so blackface minstrelsy, we're going to see Frederick Douglass is going to critique it, and he's very angry about it. And again, it is during his time in the antebellum era. And he establishes another model that, again, or establishes the original model that Du Bois is going to swerve from. And his model that he establishes that white interest in black music has to involve some type of illicit appropriation, superficial understanding, and basically just trying to get rich off of black folk. Du Bois is going against that. When Du Bois suggests that the meaning of the music is basically that sometime, somewhere, men will judge men by their souls and not their skin, he's going against this. But it is Frederick Douglass's model which is persisted into our own time. And it is a very useful model. It has been a very useful model in understanding performers and understanding how performers interact with the music that they present. But at the same time, I think there's an issue in that it doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily the be-all, end-all of interpretations. These characters, these figures, Phil Woods, up here playing the saxophone, was a white jazz guy that basically loved Charlie Parker. He idolized Charlie Parker. He emulated his style. He played his music. But he was concerned. He was worried. Because he thought maybe that people thought he was stealing the music. And so he met with a group of jazz musicians, including Dizzy Gillespie, the man up there. He met with Dizzy Gillespie and said, I'm really worried that people are going to think I'm stealing the music. Gillespie said, forget that. What Charlie Parker gave was a gift. Just like with Du Bois, the gift of black music. It's a gift. And if you can hear it, you can play it. If you can hear it, you can play it. Now the other thing is, a little earlier, a couple of months earlier, Dizzy Gillespie had given an interview to Mike Wallace. He had given this interview to Mike Wallace, and Mike Wallace pushed him, saying, don't African Americans, at the time, the terminology Negroes, don't Negroes have like a special thing with music, in that it is almost like biologically connected to them? And Gillespie said, no. I don't think God would have given any one particular group of people any special feeling like that. It's about environment. It's about environment, not about race. And so again, what we see happening here, I think, is a questioning of that the original model, blackface model, which again is very useful, but it's not complete. So we move to Elvis Presley. And this is Elvis Presley and B.B. King in December of 1956. And this is an occasion where Elvis Presley was attending, not performing, but attending a concert in Memphis, the WDIA Goodwill Review. And it was a charity concert, and Elvis was in the wings, and he just wanted to go. Now, this is December of 1956. Elvis had already had his two appearances on the Ed Sullivan Show. He had already had several golden records, several hit songs. But what gets me is, if you look at this particular photograph, and you look at he and B.B. King, and you look at Elvis, and you look at how He looks totally excited to be where he is. Am I just making that up, or is that true, do you think? Does he look excited to be back there with B.B. King? Yeah? He's a fan. He's a fan. And we'll talk about how Elvis is just an example of people like him, and there were countless numbers of people like him at the time who were getting into African American music, rhythm and blues, black radio. So he's a fan. So he's not, like trying to take the music or doing anything. He's just basically loving the music for what it is. Now, the thing about rock and roll, and again, Elvis Presley is with rock and roll. In the 1950s, we're going to see where a lot of people are not taking rock and roll music seriously. Or if they are, they're thinking that it is something that is somewhat distorted. It's part of a mass culture debate and argument that's going on in this country. I have that slide, that little picture up there on the top, with all those people, 3D glasses, to sort of indicate that you have all these people who are just sort of mass people watching a movie, and they don't really necessarily have anything else in common. They're just a sort of an isolated, disconnected mass of people. All these other things are basically looking at mass culture, reason why mass culture arguments came about. One is because of what's going on in Germany and the use of propaganda. This is Joseph Goebbels. He's a propaganda minister in Germany, in Nazi Germany. And what they do is they're basically promoting lies as truth. And what comes out of this period on the part of after the war on this side is that the use of technology, that basically you can create quote unquote truth despite the fact that it's not. We see on this side Joseph McCarthy from Wisconsin, Senator Joseph McCarthy, who gets involved in the communist witch hunt. Again, basically, all of this creates a problem for many intellectuals in the 50s about popular music. Because the belief is that all of these kids everywhere in the United States are all the same. They are part of a mass. There is no differentiation between any of these consumers of rock and roll music. They all are the same, whether they live in Utah, California, Mississippi, or Tennessee. They're all the same. I argue differently. These slides deal with the context of the period in which Elvis Presley, Little Richard, Chuck Berry, Buddy Holly, Jerry Lee Lewis, Johnny Cash, that all these people are living in and basically engaging in rhythm and blues music. This is part of the Jim Crow, Jane Crow South. We see the whole thing with colored only, colored water fountains, white water fountains, people sitting in areas designated colored, schools that are black and white, separated. Even a Rex Theater for colored only, for colored people. I remember growing up in South Louisiana in the 1970s. We still had a Rex Theater like that. I went to a pediatrician, and I always wondered, there were two rooms. There were two waiting rooms in the doctor's office. By the time I was going to the doctor there, segregation was over. And it wasn't used for racial purposes, but you still had those two rooms. And I was wondering, why? So later, after you get into that kind of like history that you always think about, kind of this self-journey, I realized what's happening there. That in my doctor's office, at one time, that was basically the Jane Crow waiting room. Right there. Emmett Till in the middle. Maybe many of you are familiar with Emmett Till, who was lynched, a young man, 14 years old. Brutalized, lynched. This is what's happening in the 1950s. This is what's happening when all of a sudden you have a bunch of white working class kids from all over the South, from Mississippi, Tennessee, Louisiana, Alabama, all of these kids, not all of them, I can't say that. A lot of these kids are falling in love with rhythm and blues at the same time that this is happening. Those kids are not the same as the kids in Utah or the kids in California, right? The kids in Utah don't have to put up with this, did they? No, they did not. This is part of this history. Where did this come from? Where did this come from? If we go back and look at the beginnings of a culture of segregation, there's a very prominent African-American historian by the name of Rayford Logan. Rayford Logan once said that the 1890s and the first decade of the 20th century was the nadir, N-A-D-I-R, the nadir of the African-American experience in the Western Hemisphere. The 1890s and first decade of the 20th century. Does anybody think something sounds wrong with that? The 1890s? What does nadir mean anyway? N-A-D-I-R, what does that mean? Low point. It's the lowest point for African Americans in the Western Hemisphere. Now, what's the problem with that? Look at the history of this country and the history of African Americans in this country. What is a red flag that suddenly strikes us? Why would this man, an African American historian, say that the 1890s is the low point? What came before that? Slavery. Wouldn't you think slavery was a low point? Over 300 years of slavery? Wouldn't that have been the low point? No, he's arguing that this is the low point. And this is a significant period. This is the origins of the New South. The origins of the New South. And the way that it always goes with the South and race relations, what's basically going to be bad for African Americans is going to be bad for the entire South. So the entire South is going to suffer because what it puts African Americans through. But this is what we see happen, the whole thing with Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal. You know, we see those little different cars. We got a poll tax up there, the lynching. We're going to see in the 1890s, for instance, over 200 people, an average of 200 people a year were lynched. And that's the only ones we know about. That's the 1890s. That's the low point. And this is popular music. We see at the same time that you're going to see the rise of Jane and Jim Crow segregation, the same time that you see the lynching, the same time that you see disfranchisement. You're also going to see the rise of the coon song craze, the coon song craze. And earlier we were talking in the library, for those of you that were there, about sheet music, how important sheet music was. And again, going back to what Dr. Paul said, during this period, pianos, during the ragtime era, particularly pianos were like a middle class symbol. Anybody wanting to aspire to middle class would get a piano. So sheet music was really important. Sheet music, folios, the covers were really important. And so the imagery we see of coon songs, these are African American males. From where you're sitting, what you can see, what does that imagery tell you? What does that imagery tell you? Are this people that belong with the rest of us? That we all should be living together? The coon songs present an image of African Americans that they're dangerous. African American men, they're a threat. They're a threat to society. This became the most popular type of popular music in the 1890s. These types of sheet music covers sold in the millions. The most popular one was a song called All Coons Look Alike to Me by Ernest Hogan. All Coons Look Alike to Me. That's the type of popular music that people were listening to at the time. Do you think that that's just a connection, or do you think there's a coincidence between, or a connection between the rise of segregation, the lynching, the violence, and the popular music that's going on? Was that just a coincidence, or do you think there was a connection? Let's get a show of hands. Coincidence? Connection? Yeah? Sure. This imagery, these laws, the rise of things called racial etiquette, this generation of people, this history will hang on until we get into the post-World War II era. When we saw that other slide with all the things with Jim Crow and Jane Crow, it comes out of this. It is popular memory. It is popular memory. And so again, this is what those kids who were in the South listening to rhythm and blues, their parents, their older siblings, their grandparents, this is what they lived with. This is what they knew in terms of race relations, right? This is what meant something. And so again, when we look at the 20th century come about, we're going to see in the 1920s, for instance, the Jazz Age. And Louis Armstrong is up there. We got the Jazz Age. And the Jazz Age is a time when jazz, which had originated in the South, New Orleans, had basically traveled upriver through the Great Migration to places like Chicago, New York. It became quite popular across the nation. By the 1920s, it had basically taken over as a fad. The Jazz Age, where you saw jazz not only, with African Americans, but with white Americans who were into this. Now, this man is Ulrich B. Phillips. And Ulrich B. Phillips is considered the father of Southern historiography. He is considered to be the father of Southern historiography. In many ways, he is the guy that basically is going to answer the call of John Sharp Williams. John Sharp Williams wants that historian who's going to be able to tell the story of the South. And the story of the South is to make sure that African American culture does not infect white civilization in the South. Well, U.B. Phillips is the guy. 1928, in the midst of the Jazz Age, he writes an essay called The Significance of the... he writes, "The South shall be and remain a white man's country." Excuse me for a second. In looking at his personal papers, and a lot of you this morning in the library were wondering, how do we do stuff with popular music research? What do we do? Sometimes you actually have to go outside popular music. There's plenty more stuff now on popular music than there used to be. But a lot of archives still don't include a lot of popular music in some cases. But the thing is, you can go and look at the context. Look at other things that are going on at the same time. And so looking at U.B. Phillips's papers, his personal papers at the University of North Carolina and at Yale, what you discover is that he was very concerned about his time. He was very concerned. He was a historian, theoretically writing about the past, but what he's really writing about is his own time. At the University of Wisconsin, where he was teaching, they basically had a problem with jazz. In 1928, the president of the university at the University of Wisconsin comes out and says, "We have a problem on our campus because this jazz is making all of our students nuts." Now, y'all wouldn't relate to that. And so he's not just a historian writing about the past, he's writing about the present. The past is never dead. It's not even past. So he's writing about his own present. He's writing about the South shall be and remain a white man's country because he's concerned about what's going on with this whole jazz thing. Because all of a sudden you got a whole bunch of white kids who are listening to black music and getting all turned on by that. Not so much in the South, and that's a different issue, but throughout the rest of the country, he's becoming quite concerned. And so again, he sets the tone. The South shall be and remain a white man's country. This is popular memory again. This is what these kids in the 1950s and in the late 1940s, 1950s, that's what they have to deal with. This is what is there all around them. Not only through the intellectual essays of a historian, but they go outside and they walk around. What do they see? Well, they see those images we saw a while ago. Colored here, white here, right? This is what this rock and roll generation is growing up with. So we go back to the whole issue was, why did these kids turn back against that history and that popular memory? Before we do that, I want to look at this for a second, and so we're going to start talking about architecture and stuff. One of the things, when we think about Southern music, do we think about classical music? When you think about the genres of Southern music, what type of genres do you often think about? And go ahead and shout it out if you don't mind. Okay, bluegrass. What else? Zydeco, yeah, like where I'm from. Zydeco, you're right, exactly. Zydeco. What else? Gospel, yeah. You got black and white gospel, right? Okay, folk music, yeah, folk music. You got country music, yeah, country music. Rockabilly, yeah. Rock and roll, soul music, you know. Those types of music emanate from the working classes. You look historically back at all those types of music, and they actually originate with working classes of people, black and white. And so, if we look at the history of class in the South, in addition to race, if we look at the history of class in the South, that man over there, James Henry Hammond. James Henry Hammond was from South Carolina planter, South Carolina senator. James Henry Hammond came up with what was known as the Mudsill theory, Mudsill, the Mudsill theory. Now, I came up with this little drawing, or I found this little drawing to show you what a mudsill is. It's the very bottom of a structure, particularly a plantation structure. It's the very bottom that the plantation sits upon, right? Hammond talks about the mudsill theory is that the South, like other civilizations, needs a mudsill. We need workers who will basically be at the bottom supporting Southern civilization. Now he's going to argue on the Senate floor, that the mudsill is about African American slaves. Abraham Lincoln up here, he sees through that little charade, and he says, no, what the mudsill theory is about all laborers. Because the elite of the South, the people who govern the South, basically see all Southern laborers as below them. Just like John Sharp Williams. They see them as below them, and that they will always be below them. And they treat them always like they are below them. They see these people, and they want them to be children, perpetual children. They want them to always basically be people who need the supervision of quote-unquote adults. Now I'm talking about people who are like 40, 50, 60, 70 years old, right? That they're always children because of the class position that they are in. So the mudsill theory. These are popular music figures. Bessie Smith is over there. Jimmy Rogers is on top. Hank Williams is up here. Sister Rosetta Thorpe, speaking of the gospel we just mentioned a little while ago. Muddy Waters, Patsy Cline. All of these people are very prominent in their fields. They bluegrass, or not bluegrass, country, blues, early country, honky tonk, I guess. urban blues. All these people came from the working class. All of these people became performers who basically were entertaining the people that they came from. They're all pretty much the same, audience and performer. These artists all came from the working class. They became the performers of the people that they came from. James Henry Hammond, John Sharp Williams, they would have seen all of these people as mudsills. They weren't going to be separated by race. Now, we do see sometimes in history that we do see the whole class thing where you will have, and racial thing, dynamic, you will see where there's a push to try to get all white Southerners together and be against black Southerners when they're needed that way. But generally, they're perceived the same way. They are perceived the same way. One of the ways in which they respond to that, one of the ways in which the quote-unquote mudsills, one of the ways in which they respond to the way they are looked down upon is through their music. Their music basically lets them know that they are people. It lets them know that their dreams, their tragedies, and all these things matter. Now, it may not be historical in the sense that many historians like to think, well, it's not really historical. But it is historical. These people basically are expressing themselves in the only way that's available to them. And the thing about music in the South, historically, the thing about music in the South is that it didn't take political status. It didn't take economic status. If you could basically play an instrument or you could sing, then you could basically express yourself. So music was available to them to do that. And to basically tell the elites, no, we are more than what you think we are. We are more than what you think we are. So music is very vital in the South for one reason, because of that. It is because of that not only racial dynamic, but the class dynamic. Now, we're looking at, this is again something that these kids are living with. This is the Grand Ole Opry. It's a barn dance program, a radio barn dance program. And if you look at the picture, you'll see that it's basically a bunch of white people, rural people, who are on the Opry performing. And they're basically, this is a publicity still. There wasn't an individual, the only African American who was on the Opry was a man by the name of DeFord Bailey. Eventually he'll be fired. And even when he was included in programs, he was always introduced by himself on the stage alone. He was not included with the rest of the people, just like he's not in this picture now, right? And so this again, these kids in the 1950s, late 1940s, 1950s, listening to radio and basically listening to their parents and whatever, this is what they're hearing. Those are blackface performers. These two guys were up here on the left here. These two guys were stars, huge stars of the Grand Ole Opry in the 1930s and 1940s. Jam Up and Honey. They were two white guys dressed in blackface. And they basically gathered some of the most male that any of the Opry stars got. The other one there, that's Bill Monroe. We talked about bluegrass earlier. There's Bill Monroe in the middle, and that's String Bean on the left. And again, in blackface. The Opry also included, it was a radio show, they would cut away on Saturday nights to go to a national broadcast of Amos and Andy. So Amos and Andy, although they weren't literally part of the Grand Ole Opry, they were so close in the time that it appeared, okay. So that's the way African Americans were presented. Basically, they're being presented as they don't belong. They're not part of the family here, like this family kind of album here. They don't belong, right? So this is what these kids have heard from aunts and uncles and grandparents and parents. That's the image, right? suddenly we have, in the late 1940s, the introduction of black-oriented radio. Black-oriented radio is a phenomenon that we're going to see hit the South. Every major city in the South, every urban area is going to have a station, most of the time white-owned, that's going to basically feature black disc jockeys who are playing African-American music. And what you see with these people is that they are presenting a different view of African-American life and culture in the middle of a segregated society. They are presenting African-Americans in a very affirmative, positive way. That goes so much against the grain of what we had seen since the 1890s, right? This is introduced in the late 1940s. The first radio station in the South, Memphis, in WDIA, would begin broadcasting African-American oriented programming. And again, we're going to see it spread. This is what Elvis Presley is listening to. This is what Buddy Holly is listening to. This is what Carl Perkins is listening to. This is the type of message that they are getting. Wait a minute. At the same time that you're going to have these segregationist politicians who are arguing that African Americans are degraded, you actually have these people here who are saying, no, we're not. No, we're not. The context is really important. And I'd like for you to think about that as we go, as we leave. Charlie Parker again, he was in a New York, a Harlem cafe, and he was sitting with several of his buddies. And Charlie Parker had put on the jukebox a quote-unquote hillbilly record. One of his friends came up to him and said, God, that's awful. That's just awful. Why do you listen to that? He said, no, man. The stories, they come from a common reservoir, a cultural reservoir. Listen to the stories. Thank you. I really enjoyed my time here. If you have any questions, thank you for your hospitality. If you have any questions, I guess Dr. Bertrand, but thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's have a seat.
Sure.
Yeah. You can sit in this one.
This one,
yeah.
okay?
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. We have some time where I can ask you some questions,
Sure.
and then we will be on the radio at 3 p.m. And as we mentioned, there are books available. If you kind of got the bug for this topic and got interested in it, there will be books available for sale and for signing right in the lobby right after. We've been having some great conversations, and I would like to just go a little deeper into Elvis.
Okay.
Because I know that that's where you've spent a lot of time studying him and researching him. And one of the questions we talked about at dinner that sparked a really interesting conversation was, you know, sometimes people say, and you started along those lines, well, was Elvis appropriating black culture?
Right.
And you say no, that he was a fan and was doing his own thing. I wondered if you might just go into a bit more detail about that whole
Sure.
concept.
Sure. No, I think it's a really complicated issue, because I think what gets involved is basically commercial music, and I think what we do see, you know, in the early 1950s is that you did have record producers that thought, if we could find a white man that could sing like a black man, we could make $1 million. Sam Phillips is the man that would say that. And so there's been this, you know, it's really interesting when you look at music as a commodity, that ugly part gets involved with it, the business part. There obviously, Elvis Presley benefited greatly from performing music associated with African Americans. There is no doubt about that. And that if we want to start the conversation there, yeah, sure. I mean, Elvis benefited greatly. But my argument is, I think, is that Elvis was growing up as a young man, a teenager, and even before that, and he started attaching himself to African American music, African American style, African American clothing and apparel. he started doing that long before he thought anything about becoming, quote unquote, Elvis Presley. And so I think that's a really important thing to remember, is that when he's 15 years old, he's out there basically wearing clothes that have been passed down by African American performers. He's buying them used. And why? Well, he wants to go to school and be noticed, right? He wants to go out there and be noticed. The same reason he's wearing his pompadour and he's wearing his sideburns, and and he's. So I think in a way, I think what we're seeing, and Elvis isn't the only one that's doing this at the time. This is happening. We see photographs, particularly of people who, before Elvis becomes popular, we see people in other southern cities, Atlanta, Charlotte, New Orleans, that you see these white kids doing the same thing.
I think that's one of the things that's interesting. We tend to hear about Elvis now, how many years later, but it was pretty common, it sounds like.
Well, I don't want to say too common, because I think he represented sort of a segment, a growing segment, but starting out as a smaller segment of these individuals who are listening to black radio and getting turned on to that. I think it grows as it goes on. But I think what we should be asking, I think, and that's what I'm sort of pushing for in my work, is why were white kids, white working class kids who were raised in a certain segregated culture, why were they turning to black style and black music? And in fact, it's a timeless question, because we have the same question now, I think.
Right.
And so in many ways, focusing on the commercial aspect of it is really significant. And I think, Elvis enjoyed a great deal of more prosperity financially than Fats Domino, obviously.
Right.
But at the same time, we also should be asking, I think, the question of why do kids do that?
Yeah, do you have a working theory right now? Is that something that's evolved over time? Yeah, how do you answer that right now?
I think in this case particularly, and I think also maybe as it goes forward, but I think you're looking at the reason why they turn this way first is I think they are alienated, and I think they are somewhat segregated in their own way within cities. Many of them are moving into cities. Elvis's high school, for instance, was like twice the size of his hometown when he went to high school in Memphis, because they moved from Tupelo, Mississippi to Memphis. And so I think they're alienated, and I think they're looking for something as an identity to make them stand out. In a rural, and he was born poor too, he was poor in the rural areas, but there were connections in the rural areas that were missing in the urban areas. All of a sudden there's just this disconnect. You have no one really. And so I think people like him, he and others, were turning to black style as a way to identify themselves as somebody.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and I think the key role of radio, black radio, is so important because it introduces such a different version of African American culture.
Well, that was going to be my next question. If you could elaborate a little bit more on the power of radio at that time, and in your view, the significance of it, because it holds great significance to you, and I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about that.
It's, again, complicated because the way that it worked was, it's all about business. Again, it's all commercial. It's all about the business. And what happened was, after World War II, in the post-war, we did have, as I think I mentioned earlier, there was an affluence that reached across the South that had really not been there before.
Right.
And particularly following the Great Depression, and so I think a lot of people are having much more disposable income than they had ever had before, and I think African Americans are part of that, relative to the larger, but they are enjoying a prosperity as well. And so I think what happens is that business people realize that there's a market, that the African American radio listener could be a perfect market if we want to sell goods directed toward them. And so they push for radio stations to develop programming toward the African American communities within those larger areas. And I think what they're doing is, again, they have to produce a programming that is, they're not going to be doing the blackface thing. They're not going to be doing bula or anything like that. What they want to do is they want to make African Americans feel good about themselves, to go out and purchase these products that are being sponsored. They want people to tune into the radio to do that. And so I think what happens, and it was very much unintentional, and even some of these radio entrepreneurs say that. They come out and say that we're not in the business of trying to bring about racial change. We just want to sell tonnage.
Right.
You know, that's all we want to do. And so, but I think an indirect sort of thing out of that is that they begin to get, you know, and so I think you have two things that come together. You have this, you have these, you know, these kids who have always been looked down upon. Now they're in an urban area where they're even looked down upon further, and they're looking for an identity, and they happen to come across African American radio, and it seems like, wow, that's pretty cool. Yeah. Let's do that. But at the same time they're doing that, I think they also begin to realize, unlike previous generations, these are human beings. Yeah. You know, there's a really great story with, and it's not a music story, it's baseball. At the same time, 1947, Jackie Robinson, who broke the color barrier in baseball. Jackie Robinson had been signed by the Dodgers, but he was going to be sent down to the minor leagues for training down in Florida, and for a farm club. And so he was down there, and Branch Rickey, who was the general manager of the Dodgers, the guy that signed him, was sitting there with the manager, and the manager's name was Clyde Hopper. And Clyde Hopper and Branch Rickey is watching Jackie Robinson in the field. And Jackie Robinson is making play after magnificent play. And every time, Branch Rickey would slap Hopper on the back and say, man, wasn't that a tremendous play? Wasn't that like a superhuman play? Wasn't that just great? So finally Hopper, who was getting very uncomfortable, Hopper was from Mississippi. He had grown up in Mississippi. He had to go back after the season, live in Mississippi. Hopper was somebody that wasn't very comfortable about having Jackie Robinson on his team. And so here's Branch Rickey just hopping all over him saying, that's a superhuman play. Hopper looks over at Branch Rickey and says, Mr. Rickey, you really think an N-word is a human being? Wow. Wow. Yeah. Wow. That's the context we're talking about. Yeah, yeah. That's what I think is something that needs to be explored further. I think, you know, there was again, Howard Odom, a sociologist at the University of North Carolina, did a study in the mid-1940s, basically a folk study, kind of a folk, what do whites think about African Americans? And he comes up with this list, and it was like, wow, white Southerners really just thought black Southerners were almost subhuman, that they weren't even human beings. That's the context that we're dealing with, I think, that needs to be explored.
Well, thank you for this wonderful discussion. We'll continue it.
Okay, sure.
I have one last question for you that's a bit more general. We have a lot of students in the audience, and you have been a teacher and interacting with students for years and years. So I always like to ask, what advice do you have for students today, not necessarily just related to this topic or research, but just general advice for students, or anything you wish you had known when you were a student? What advice do you have for us?
I think I would tell my daughter, and my daughter finished college a few years ago, use the experience as a way to get to know yourself, as to broaden yourself, as to get to know other people. Bring other perspectives into your lives and let that change you. I always tell students that I teach, you know, you come in here and 4 years later, when you leave, if you're the same person that you came in here, probably the college experience hasn't worked the best for you. You should be different when you walk out the door. And even in my own classes, I tell students, after you walk into my class, when you leave my class, you should be a totally different person. We'll see.
Well, that's fantastic advice. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, with that, we'll close for this part. But again, there'll be books available. We'll be on the radio. And Michael, thank you so much for your talk and your time in the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.